Hi there. Thank you so much for being with me for this session. It's called Every Church Needs an AI Policy. Start here. My name is Kenny Jang, and I'm going to walk you through what I think are a critical set of questions, concerns, and issues that every single leadership team today in a church and ministry really need to think about regarding AI. Now, AI, as we know it, what we're talking about in the news today, ChatGPT, Jasper, Gemini, all these other tools really came on the scene in November 22 when OpenAI, a company, came out with this thing called a generative AI chatbot called ChatGPT. And since then, it's been a fast and furious evolution of what is available. Today, generative AI is what we call multimodal. We're starting to see tools that not only actually creates new content and newfangled things in text format, but also images and audio and video, and not just on the output side, but also on the input side. So the creative imagination of what we're able to produce with these generative AI tools is just going through the roof. We're at a point where technology is at a pace that's faster than our own imaginations. And I think this is why, as leaders, we need to be good stewards for our staff, our key volunteers, with respect to technology and help them provide guidelines and support and encouragement to use AI for good and to be good stewards of the technology God has given us. So, what we're going to go through today is what I think is three arenas or areas of concerns that every leadership team needs to think about: the practical, the theological, and the ethical. And then before we get to that, we have to think about what is the actual um, guiding principles that you're going to actually employ for coming up with an AI policy. So let's go through some guiding principles. Then let's go through practical issues, theological issues, and ethical issues. And hopefully, you'll be able to jot down some questions that you're going to need to grapple with and come up with some answers. It's a little bit of, hey, I'm here to help force the issue so that your team actually has some thoughtful discussions around these topics. Then you're able to come to agreement and then articulate them so that your staff and your volunteers are able to run with it with confidence, if that makes sense. So, let's get on with the first part, the guiding principles of what you're going to do with an AI policy. The first question I would offer is, how are these principles going to be developed? And who's involved with all of this stuff when it comes to AI? I think there's two divergent paths that you can actually take if you really wanted to in terms of how to answer this question. The first one is, the path of, hey, these principles were basically defined by the leadership team, a closed door meeting, the executive committee, etc. Limited input from external community members or even experts, etc. You're going to make the decisions and then roll it out. The other avenue, the other end of the spectrum, is that you can actually take a collaborative approach, maybe build an AI oversight committee, and that might pull from a diverse range of people in your actual community that has representation of the church values and priorities, but really is inclusive of everybody there so you can have a thoughtful approach. There's no right or wrong answer, but I think you need to start to think about that at the very beginning as you attack coming up with an AI policy for your organization. The second question is, how will this policy empower the church to make informed and responsible decisions about AI, right? And again, I think you have two different paths. One is, are you going to be in a space where you're trying to provide flexible, principle based frameworks that your staff and your employees, your volunteers can actually take and interpret and use, right? Or is it a much more rigorous rules based approach where you are really ensuring the safety of everybody and you're doing the hard work of coming up and defining the approaches, the points of views that everyone on your team is supposed to do, so you don't have um, this risk of lack of uniformity of approaching AI. I think there's a very important fork in the road for you to think through. The next thing that we have to talk about is, in terms of a guiding principle, is the scope, right? So, are there specific departments, people, leaders, activities? Is it just for staff, not volunteers? What's included, what's not included? And so, your policy should really start to think through and talk about Is it across all operations, all ministry fronts, every single department, every employee? And maybe you cherry pick and say no, it's not for this specific subset. Or is it just broadly you're going to define from the get go that says, look, we're only going to use it in this type of function. Maybe it's just research or administrative or process automation, something that's very low risk. And it's not going to be applied to things that are larger, broader category. Anything that involves congregate interactions, right? You want to figure out these broad categories of where you can use it and where you cannot in the building. I think that's something that we have to grapple with, and there's a lot of intended and unintended consequences for that. Now, in terms of operations, your guiding principles should ask this question of how will your church ensure consistent application of the policy, whatever you come up with, that goes across everything. So you can either integrate it into your all governance structure and make sure it's formal and it's part of anything and everything you do. Is it part of your 360 reviews? Is it part of your team meetings, agendas? Where does it show up every single day? Or is it just something really decentralized? Do you empower each of your leaders at the different levels, both at the ministry department level, the team level, etc.? Do you decentralize that decision of how it's going to be applied, how it's going to be actually, kept up with, accountability, all that kind of stuff? So I said there are three different broad buckets that we have to think about in terms of real issues to define for AI policies. First one is practical, second one, theological and ethical, right? And so the practical considerations, there's a couple of them. I think about six or seven that I think you can start off with. Now, these are all suggestions. They're not mandates, but hopefully these will start to build those discussions in a healthy way with your internal teams as you go about trying to figure out how we can actually build guidance strict enough that it makes sense, but flexible enough that it accommodates the quickly evolving nature. The velocity of the changes happening with AI is just so quick. So we want to be very practical in that manner. So what's the first thing? So the first question is about AI apps and tools. What criteria are you going to have in order to approve and evaluate the tools? So is it that your church has an opportunity to say, we're going to just allow any and all experimentation to happen. We trust our leaders, and there's over the past quarter, there was over 1,000 new AI apps launched to the marketplace this last quarter alone. There's no way to know all of them, right? So do you just trust everybody to go off and discover them, try them out, word of mouth, trade notes with each other, etc.? Or is there a more stringent process? I think that's one of the things that you have to think about. So that question of is it something that you have a committee to approve or not, is really important. The second aspect of that is how often is that reviewed list going to be updated, and what's the process for that, right? Is it on a quarterly basis? Is it on a monthly basis? Is it ad hoc? Is it something where you want to minimize disruption in terms of training and development, right? Because as you know, there's a learning curve with every tool, and you don't want AI to be just that shiny object, that puppy dog syndrome of chasing shiny objects all the time and having a learning curve with every single new tool out there. So do you take a more conservative approach and say, hey, we're only going to specify this set of tools. Maybe it's 3, 6, 10 tools, whatever the number it might be. And we're going to hold on to them and almost like double down on them for the time being, for the season. And it will be hard for new tools to break into it. We're going to see what other innovators, outliers do, report back, and maybe that might come into the mix. But for the most part, we're going to just hunker down on this core set of tools. Or again, is there a dynamic process where there's new tools that come on the market, specialized functions, that are trying to solve specific problems that would be very relevant to any specific given job, task, or project, and you can actually have a process to review it. So that's another question that you have to think through on yourself. That's very practical for everybody involved. Responsibilities is the next practical issue, right? How is your church going to ensure that everybody has the actual expertise, training, authority, in order to do that the stuff with the AI that they want to. So, are you going to invest in formal training? Is there actual development plans that you're going to bake into it? Just like with any other leadership development uh, pipeline that you might have, is AI part of that? I think that's a very important question of how formalized is AI going to be in that leadership development. That talks about budget, it talks about time, it talks about energy, effort, investment in that. Or are you going to just rely on the existing expertise in the specific roles? Again, a decentralized uh, worldview of this, where you're actually not going to devote much training to it. It's going to be ad hoc. And so the individual leaders are going to be able to say, we need this tool to actually solve this problem. We've hit a roadblock, so we're going to bring in some expertise, get a workshop, find some webinars, maybe go to a conference. I think that this is a very big open-ended question as to the fostering approach, and I think it's more about permission for your leaders at all levels of how are they supposed to get up to speed with these newfangled tools. Now, one of the best things that we are trying to do in our communities here is to aggregate leaders and share notes with each other, whether it's the AI Next podcast or video training series, or whether it's the training platform at aiforchurchleaders.com, or the Facebook group that has nearly 6,000 leaders in the AI for Church Leaders Facebook group. I think you have to think through at how much encouragement are you going to give to your leaders to pursue formal topical resources for training and development in that capacity. The next one is just continuing education, right? So that specialized training, is it something that you treat as if many churches have actual budgets individually that someone can actually buy books, go to conferences, actually hire coaches or training development experts, bringing them in as speakers for teams? Those are the types of questions I think you need to do. Or is it, hey, we'll invest at this basic level, we'll give everyone access to something, kind of like the training library at aiforchurchleaders.com. And then after that, it's up to you to level up, because everyone's going to have their own level of interest and applicability in their individual roles. But we will give some basic training so that everyone's literate and get up to speed. But beyond that, you're on your own. So I think that's another question. Budget and funding is related to this, right? So how are you going to prioritize and allocate? Um, there's an app for that type of mentality, so that your budget can balloon very quickly. Whose responsibility is it to harness and to be able to take these tools and integrate them into your ministry? So, one of the questions right here is, are you able to allocate on a corporate level, right? Funding that exists now for technology, development, leadership, etc., on a corporate level, church wide, or is it something that's very flexible on an ad hoc basis? Is it something that you earmark, or someone needs to nominate something and pitch and propose something? There's a lot of circumstances where if someone wants to learn a specific craft, that they would actually go ahead and come up with some little, like a little proposal, give it to their manager, and then on an ad hoc basis they would actually evaluate it. And related to that, how does that training get brought back into the church staff and shared with others so that it's not compartmentalized? We want to democratize the access of any new learning that you have across any given area for AI with others that it's relevant for. The next question around budget and funding is, what are the measures that the church is going to take to make sure that it's actually available to everybody and not just the pastors, not just senior leaders, or not just one team that might actually have all the bells and whistles, right? So, practically speaking, are you able to proactively identify and address those barriers? Some of the barriers might be related to volunteers in particular that don't have flexible schedules to be on site during the day with staff. It might be part-time staff versus full-time staff that might be in the office only on certain days. It might be accessibility issues. There's so many things that you have to talk about in terms of inclusion and getting rid of these barriers to access, because AI is going to be something that's integral to everything that we do. This is not just a perk. This is something that's going to be infused into everybody's job at some level, every activity, everything. Over the next couple of years, you're going to see the integration of this AI at a level that you've never thought about today. The other opportunity is to think of it very differently, right? That it's a very self-directed, decentralized approach where individual ministries themselves are responsible for figuring that out. Again, I think there's a risk to be had if you do that. If you're not, compartmentalize, if you're compartment, um, compartmentalizing this, I think there is a risk to that. That if you don't have a church-wide perspective to some degree, to be able to democratize access to AI training, and classes and support, then you might have some people that are left behind, and we don't want to do that in our workforce. Now, in terms of application, right? Like, what is the mechanism that you're going to use to monitor all this stuff being used over time? I think this is a really important question here. And how you answer this question has a lot of ramifications, right? So, are you going to establish regular audits, reviews, feedback loops? Are you going to take this seriously to that degree where you're going to assess how are we using AI in any given area? Now, on a very plain level, the executive pastors here are going to say, yes, I'm definitely going to do that from a budgetary stance because this happens all the times across departments with software or other services where you might be paying for the same thing multiple times, especially if you have a decentralized approach to things, right? One department might be using this same tool as another department, and they don't even know where they could have had cost savings together. So, on a very plain level, from a budget standpoint, having an audit, going through that assessment might be something that makes sense. But beyond that, trying to figure out how everybody is using it, if they're using it well, in terms of data hygiene and privacy and ethical uses of it. I think it's really important. Or do you actually take on a specific like governance role mentality where there's an oversight committee that gets started and they are the ones that actually are responsible of it for it, but they have very limited actual oversight, right? So it's like a special committee. I think there's, depending on your size and also the model of structure of your church, one or the other might make sense. So those are the practical things that I would think about first. And I'm sure there's all these other questions that get spawned off of those discussions. After you start through the practical things, I think the next set of questions are theological, right? We are in ministry. We're a little bit different than the marketplace, and there are things that we need to consider from a biblical worldview to make sure that there's alignment with everything that we're doing. And so the first question is, how does our church, right? Um, the use of AI in our church, how does it align with the theological views of human stewardship over creation? That man versus machine type of thing, it does come into play. You see it in Genesis, where the question can easily be framed in terms of the church views responsible development and deployment of AI in a way that sees it as faithful stewardship over resources, right? Like God has entrusted us with this tool and we have dominion over the earth, and so we are the stewards that are able to deploy this. The other way to think about it, and you see that in James and Proverbs and some other places, this other worldview is that, hey, AI is actually quite a dangerous technology that can undermine what we really value. We really value human will, personal responsibility, the sanctity of life, that need for ongoing divine revelation, that relationship, that guidance, that humanity aspect is central core, and we must protect it. And that AI has the risk of disrupting that and making us over reliant on technology. And so that's a very different way to think about what AI offers us. The next idea that I think that we have to think about is, in terms of technology and AI specifically, is do we see that as a space for the divine to do its work, right? How do you navigate the tensions between tech and divinity? What does that mean for you, right? So does the church that you are at, right, philosophically, theologically, do you see AI as a tool that can be used for all of its abilities to understand and apply the timeless truths of the Bible and Scripture and what God and Jesus is teaching us beyond what has been available up to date? Meaning, has the tool been given to us now to be able to do even more beyond what we've done in the history of mankind? There is an inflection point that we are in right now that AI is forcing for us to enter into a different chapter. The other way you might think about it is the church is deeply concerned that, look, we have this tendency as humans to have an over reliance on technology, and especially in this category of AI driven decision making. We've seen that with in social media and algorithms and how that has taken over our lives, especially our young people. And I think in general, most people don't think that that's a good thing anymore, right? And so, is that something that would undermine the priority of, again, that's ongoing spiritual discernment and the humanity of life that God has given us, and that it isn't an actual expansion of the opportunities for divine witness, and but it is the opposite. The second idea that I have here in terms of theology is adoption. Like, how does this policy align with our broader values and priorities? Right. So, does it directly support our mission to leverage this technology in in service of spiritual growth, in service of social justice, in service of community empowerment, in service of um, relationship, going deeper in our relationship with Jesus Christ? Or is technology and this AI specifically need to maintain a clear separation between the church's spiritual functions and the technology application that we have for it? Like, how we adopt it is going to be determined by what our worldview is theologically of where technology fits within that picture. The next issue is prioritize value. What are the specific outcomes that we expect in terms of being able to manage AI properly, to steward it with a policy like this? Um, some churches are going to be very bullish and very aggressive and say, hey, we are looking for increased efficiency and productivity. We're going to drive more engagement. We're going to strengthen the ability of the church to fulfill its mission and serve the community. And we see the upside of this, and we must take advantage of it now. We don't want to feel like the servant who has buried the talent, and when the master comes back, we haven't done anything with it yet. The other way to look at it is that we have to focus on maintaining the trust and confidence of everybody involved in our community, not just their staff, but the congregation and the community even broader. And we need to demonstrate, right? We need to be above board. We need to be completely controlled and measured in our approach to AI implementation so we don't risk anything and we don't put anyone at risk. That value of AI, where we prioritize adoption of it, is a sign of our understanding of where it's going to take us later. Right? What is our expectations? Are we going to take the lever and push it forward? Is the gear all the way um, fast forward, or is it something that's, slow it down, neutral, or maybe even reverse? I think that's a really important underlying theological question that we have to answer that will determine where we end up with that. Now, we have the practical, we have the theological, and we also have ethical considerations to think about. And this is just one of those things where all church leaders have this on their radar, that AI brings up these ethical issues that we're really concerned about. And so this is where you need to grapple with it. I think this is a very healthy exercise for teams to use these as discussion points for yourself. So, very specifically, tactically speaking, in terms of how we handle our congregational data, comes down to an ethics worldview. Like, what specific data privacy security protocols that we're going to actually have? Are we going to take the time to build those SOPs, as we call it, the standard operating procedures, so that we can implement the highest industry standards for privacy control, so that we actually, um, even have levels of access to congregational data because it is personal information. Do we encrypt stuff? Do we actually have backups? Where is it backed up, on site, off site? Do we actually have a process to come back and audit our process to see if we're doing the right thing? That level of oversight is, I think, really important. Or is it something that's a little bit pragmatic, saying, "Hey, we're not a tech company; we are a ministry. We don't have a huge IT department or resources to do that. And so we want to figure out what the minimum level that we're comfortable with in our ministry for data protection, right? So legal, regulatory compliance, but maybe even something further. But I think that's the question of how rock solid do we want to be in hindsight, especially if something goes wrong. That's your risk tolerance. The other question is, how are we going to talk about transparency, attribution, both internally within our staff, within our teams, within our direct report and manager relationships, and with the congregation, right? Attribution is a really important thing in terms of the most public thing, probably is the preacher who's building a manuscript. Do they disclose and use AI tools for research, for copywriting, for analysis, for grammar, for all the levels of usage of AI to make that message the most compelling that it might be? And I think that's a question that every single ministry needs to answer for themselves, right? Transparency is a big thing. We all value it, but wherever you are on the spectrum is very different for every ministry. So some churches might commit to publishing regular reports and have open office hours or town meetings in terms of, let's invite all the community stakeholders, congregation members, leaders to the table and have some open mic nights or show and tells to show everybody how AI is being used in different areas so that there is full transparency, especially how we manage congregational data, giving data, um, attendance data, all these other things that we have in our church management software systems that AI is going to start to impact. The other way to say is, look, we're going to have a limited internal focus on AI activities. We don't need to be super transparent with everybody outside. They're not proactively demanding it. There's not this thing that's it's not a crisis. We don't need to feed the beast. And so you might say, hey, share the information regarding AI only on a need to know basis or with key decision makers or the ministry leaders in the areas or the volunteers that it actually impacts or has visibility on. I think that comfort level is something that you as a church leadership have to define so that your employees, your staff, and your volunteers are a lot more comfortable figuring out, what is it corporately that they can actually lean back on where they don't need to be put into the situation of making that decision on their own. The next is just straight ethical issues. How are you going to monitor the issues of bias, fairness, and transparency? Again, so is it most of the times when we're coming to ethics, you want to shine a light on it, not darkness, right? And one of the best ways is regular checkups, regular audits, regular ongoing interviews. You want to monitor things to make sure that they're handled in the right way. So just going through the same protocol. It might be as simple as a regular interview with every employee of how are you using AI? Can you give me some examples of how you've used it in the last month or the last quarter? And just going through that to see if you catch any unintended misuses from the lens of the leadership, right? And so that might be one way to do it. Another one is, the other direction is you're going to focus primarily just you want to make sure everyone just complies with the rules and the laws, regulations. You don't want to micromanage people. You trust them. You're principles based, and so you want to make sure you give them the freedom to do stuff, but you want to reinforce and remind them on the principles that not are not just AI specific, but broad based in general. Another question that I think is really interesting is how are you going to engage the community stakeholders to gather feedback and address concerns relating to AI? We know from studies that have been done from Glue and Barna and even AI Next that congregation members are not fully embracing or liking the idea if their church is using it. Now, the marketplace and the secular culture is embracing AI like crazy, but we know that from surveys that most congregation members, the generic thought of if they knew that the pastor was using AI to write the sermon, they're not super thrilled about that. So, what do we do with that? How do we gather that feedback and address that stuff? So, do you actively support that exercise of gaining feedback, of trying to talk to different stakeholders and bring them along, normalize the talking of it? or do you actually, relegate that activity to a committee? Some, you have to have a shepherd, a champion of AI within the ministry, and then you just make that the point person, and it's up to them, almost like a micro ministry, with their own discernment of where they need to go and engage different stakeholders directly. I think that's something that either can open up a Pandora's box either way, or it can actually bring comfort and peace to your people. So it could, either one of these could have unintended consequences. I think you have to think it through. It really depends on the culture of your organization and your community. Compliance is a really important thing, right? You want to comply with the laws, the specific laws, regulations, industry standards. You want to comply with them. And so, are we going to do that in a way that actually is best practice? And usually, best practices is in terms of, are you going to record every time you download a database? Say we're using giving data. Every time you use giving data and you anonymize it and you put it into AI tools, are you going to record that just because if something happens later, you will actually have a record of it, like a diary? Are there protocols like that? Or is it something else where you're saying, hey, we're going to trust the stewardship on a local level, and each individual team leader, based on their own comfort level, is going to be responsible for what they have. Executive pastors, obviously, on this topic are going to think very differently than most employees. And this also is probably where um, insurance and other coverage might come into play. Uh, how will the governance be enforced, right? With your specific church structure, like with your decision making processes, where does that come into play? I think you have to just think through, talk it through different scenarios. Role playing, I think, is a very good exercise to answer these set of questions, right? So again, one of the things that we're seeing is that there's a director of AI or committee of AI oversight being popularized. That notion that someone's going to have it. I think in 5 years from now, AI is going to be in everyone's role, so you're not going to have something that's separate. But this is a question of, hey, do you fully integrate that into the actual structure, the executive committee, budgeting, every single level of your church governance? Or is it something that, it's a external extracurricular activity, and those recommendations are given to the executive leadership team? They don't have a vote at the table, but they are advisors, and that they influence how your church is going forward. Risk assessment is another one. Like, do you actually have a assessment framework to evaluate what's going to happen? What if this happens? So you can spend a whole day on this or a whole retreat on this to figure out both, you know, legal, operational, ethical, reputational factors that might come into play in terms of what happens if a counseling pastor took copious notes on a bunch of high risk cases and fed it into a whole, mix of AI tools asking for advice, but then it got ingested, and because of the privacy policy, now is part of the large language model. And who knows where that comes out in several years? And it might actually come out somewhere. Or is it something that, you know, you say, hey, we're going to adopt a more streamlined or risk based approach in terms of just taking the most high visibility, high impact cases that might happen and build a crisis plan for that. And the last one in terms of ethics is, what are the contingency plans or fallback options that you have in case something happens? That crisis plan is real, because AI is something that, again, while it probably isn't the first default posture for most staff, it will be increasingly tempting to outsource wholly decisions and actions to AI tools and AI bots and all these things that are going to happen in this next year or two, to hand over the responsibilities of things to them without keeping a human in the loop. And so, what happens if something goes wrong? So, are you going to have backup processes? Are you going to actually have these uh, non AI systems, that these analog processes that you're going to have as backups? so that you have protocols for, hey, things went wrong. The AI went haywire. We're going to actually need to do something manual or analog, and having a system of redundancy. The other one is, are you just going to say, hey, these AI systems are being developed by professionals. They have their own safeguards put into place. They've got watchdogs. Is that something where we don't need to worry about it? And that whatever you have right now in terms of like IT response, if all of your servers crashed, or if there was a hacker, or if there's malware that comes into play, is that just something that is treated like everything else, right? Is it just a general IT tech issue for your church? So there you have it. We have three sets of types of areas of concerns that you need to start to think through: practical, theological, ethical. And once you start to think through those things, you want to write them down, but you want to do that with the lens of those guiding principles that we started with. And once you do that, you'll see that you'll have a pretty robust document, a draft per se, that you can start to publish and discuss with your teams. Our recommendation is that you want open discussions with your staff to see where everyone lands. And the other thing is, this is very different than a standard like an HR handbook. This is a living document because of the velocity and the nature of how AI is evolving and all the new innovations that are happening in space. This is something you're going to need to revisit and revise on a regular basis. So I would be prepared for that. But I think hopefully these questions give you some general frameworks that are applicable to all of these ideas, whether it's practical, theological, or ethical, as long as you are conscious and aware of those arenas and that you're trying to address all three of them, you should be in a good spot. My name is Kenny Jang. I'd love to hear how you come out on the other side of creating an AI policy. Here are some of the places that I hang out: churchtechtoday.com, aiforchurchleaders.com. I also am the director this year of the AI Next initiative for Exponential. Would love to see you there as well. We are publishing podcasts and video seminars and workshops and research, and I would love to hear from you specifically of what would be of most value in your own journey, wherever you are in your journey with AI and education and integrating it into your ministry. What are the questions that you have, and what are the next things that you think would be helpful in leveling up your ministry so that you can have more impact with the technology that God has given us?